Welcome back. Last video, I discussed the Spaniards' debut trip to the Americas and the jackpot they hit when they discovered the pre-Columbian societies. In today's video, we'll continue going deeper into their mainland activities, such as the conquering of the Aztecs. Now, if you are of Mexican descent or just love Mesoamerican culture and history, then this episode is going to be one for you. Now, as I said, I'm going to be going in depth discussing the Aztecs and local tribes of the surrounding areas, such as the Purepecha of Michoacan. Now, since we're on the topic of Michoacan, an interesting fact that I'd like to get into before going deeper into this video is just an interesting connection, I would say, that it has with the state of Michigan. Now, Michoacan is the Midwestern portion of Mexico. Now, of course, we know that Michigan is the Midwestern part of the United States, although that's not the connection that I'm making, but it's still interesting. So, the word Michoacan means place of the fishermen, and the word Michigan means great water or large lake. Now, of course, Michoacan would come from the Nahuatl language, as this was what the Aztecs referred to as the home of the Purepecha. Now, granted, they would have their own name for the region where they live, and we would get into that later. But for the time being, I'm making this point significant because it was the Aztecs who were actually said to have come from the southwestern region of the United States, which is very close to Michigan, speaking relative. Now, the Ojibwe would have been the group that would have given the name, or I should say, would be where the name Michigan came from. So they had a name for this place called Michigami, and from the word Michigami came Michigan. Now, both Michoacan and Michigan, or Michigami, they have to do with large bodies of water and fishing, and both would have been in that the Midwestern region, whether south or north, but like the Midwestern region of the United States. So just thought this was an interesting point to make, especially as I will be going into some of my own personal theories throughout this series. And one of those theories would actually be that most of the Americas at one point in time were actually a part of one large empire. Now, of course, from that split, you would have gotten some of the early tribes, right? Or early civilizations, I should say, like maybe like the Olmecs or the Mississippians. Um, but we'll dig more into that later. But in the meantime, let's start the show. Now, it's important to realize that the conquistadors and early explorers that came from Spain, they were not all disciplined men with morals, at least not in today's context, right? A lot of them were not only pirates, but the illegitimate children of nobles, children who may have not been the eldest or the son, meaning that they would receive no land or wealth from their fathers, meaning they had to make their own way. Um, you also had people who were just desperate for wealth and would do anything to secure it. You had some criminals on one end of the spectrum, which would balance out with, I guess, the amount of clergymen or friars and priests who were on the other end of the spectrum. Now, Hernán Cortés is going to be the main conquistador as far as the story of the Aztecs. He would actually come from a Hidalgo lineage, his father being from Medellin, which was an area in Extremadura where most of the conquistadors would come from. He actually gained minor nobility through his military service. Now, Extremadura was known for producing great soldiers, as this area was their was where many decorated war veterans were awarded land by the crown. Also, this area was a border town to an area that was raided often for centuries by Islamic forces, as the location was where the land of the Christian kingdoms met with the land of the Al Andalus Empire. So, the towns basically where most of the conquistadors came from. The people there honed impressive military IQ just over the centuries. Now, most of the hidalgos, their sons, were brought up in a military culture. So not only did they learn to hunt and fight from a very young age, but they learned strategy. They also understood that being from modest means, the only way to quickly rise in status and wealth would be military campaigns. However, during this time period, there weren't as much military campaigns for the amount of soldiers or young men that wanted to prove themselves. So the next best thing would be joining expeditions to the New World. Now, just to list a few of the conquistadors who would have come from that area, the same area as Hernan Cortés, would be Hernando de Soto, Francisco Pizarro, Vasca Nunez de Balboa, and Pedro Valdivia. Now, pay attention to those names as you're going to hear them in the near future, actually, in this video. Now, their tactics were no different than their European counterparts, and by their, I'm referring to the Spanish. However, one can say that the Spanish left the blueprint on how to do things, especially when it comes to dealing with the indigenous. Now, another thing that I would like to point out that this was something that was also done by every single European nation that would come to the Americas. Of course, after learning from the Spanish, but over and over again, after each conquest of an area, there would be the importation of Europeans to those new areas. Now, shortly after the initial colonization of the Americas, it's estimated that around 240,000 Spaniards migrated to the New World. As time went on, the native population became the minority, and mestizos became an emerging class right under the Spaniards. Now, when I say mestizo, I'm referring to basically the admixture or basically biracial offspring from either the Spanish and the Indigenous or other groups of people who would have came over there because you would have, of course, had a lot of Indians, right? Especially from like the Mughal Empire, which is funny because as we get deeper in these videos, you'll kind of hear some of those connections, or even the Philippines, by way of the Manila Galleons. So again, just mestizo is just basically an interracial offspring. Now, in just a few years after dominating the Americas, as I said, that would become an emerging class. And then shortly after dominating the Caribbean, the Spanish would actually make their way to what is now known as Panama. Now, this would be a strategic location for them for many reasons, including it being the royal route to transport their new riches back to Europe. Now, originally occupied by the Cueva, the Chibchan, and the Chocoan peoples, Panama became the first colony on the Pacific Ocean for the Spanish. Something to be mindful of is a lot of these tribal names were not what the people identified themselves as, and the Cueva would be no different, as this was a name given by the Spanish. However, soon after arriving, they would inflict the same punishment onto them as they did their distant relatives back in the Caribbean. Many of the natives would flee into the nearby islands, or to regions deeper in the jungle to escape the destruction caused by their new neighbors. But just as many fled, many also fought to the death and actually became revered by the Spanish. Some of the important indigenous um, people who would go down in history as either being major components for the resistance or people who aid the Spanish in their conquest. And one such would be Chief Careta. Now, he would be from the Darien region. Seeing the sick and starving Spaniards, he took it upon himself to feed them and give them rest, as all throughout the Americas, there seemed to have been rules, I should say, for how foreigners were to be treated, especially people who are coming to your land. Um, and you will see that there's a pattern of, even if they had suspicious, thoughts about you, they would still be nice and kind and treat you with courtesy. Now, of course, you would be watched, but they wouldn't do anything to you if you didn't give them a reason to, for the most part, unless they had very, very, very good reason to believe that you were coming with ill intent. But in this case, for sure, Chief Caretta realized that if war came to their lands, his people would suffer the most. So peace was also his motive. It is said that he actually told Balboa that the land gives enough for all men, and if they come with open hands, it should be theirs. However, to not come with closed fists. So, in a sense, it's look, there's enough for everybody. So, no need to fight or kill to try to take anything when it can be just given to you if you come in peace. But of course, being long eyed and blinded by greed, the Spanish then kidnapped the chief and held him for ransom in return for gold and food, something that they would also do over and over again. And you will start to notice the trend. Before releasing him, and on the threat of burning their village, he actually forced an alliance. Basically, an agreement that they would join the Spanish to fight against any other chiefs or regions. And of course, like in their plan to conquest that whole area. Now, local legend tells that the chief daughter actually fell in love with Balboa, and like you will see in many other contact stories, the daughter of a powerful chief falling in love with the foreigner at the expense of her own people. Now, this would be no different than that of the Floridian princess of the Tocobaga region, Eulalie, um, which happened around the 1520s, or even the story of Pocahontas in Jamestown, which happened in the early 1600s, just to name a few. Now, the chief went down in the region's history as being the chief who fed his enemy and ended up betraying his people because of it. And his daughter essentially was the Melinche before Melinche. And that'll make sense in a little bit. But she was practically the first Melinche. Now, Chief Ponko, on the other hand, would be hailed as a local legend of folklore and was known as the protector of the jungle. Knowing of the enslavement of the nearby tribes, as well as the destruction of homes, stealing of food, raping of women, etc., etc., Ponka actually sent his runners into every village that was in his reach to warn them. And something interesting that I want to just make mention of when I speak of his runners. Now, the Incas are known for their runners known as Chaskis. But you're going to see, and it's my goal to actually point out, because it's all going to tie into my theory, that many American cultures, and when I say America, I'm talking North, Central, South, as there were no modern day borders as we have now. Um, but a lot of American cultures had similar things, from gods to runners, if I may say, like weapons. You will see, and it's all going to tie in. But anyway, he sent his runners to every village to warn them. Now, Balboa then demanded gold and food, and of course, an alliance from Ponca as well. And Ponca, being the opposite from Careta, he actually refused. What he did do, though, was send a basket of river stones, saying, "If the white men hunger for gold, let them eat the bones of the river." That night, it was said that his warriors led an all out assault against the Spanish, as they saw them arrive with war dogs, and I can imagine just, their muskets, their cannons, and anything else that would basically give the context that, okay, these men are coming to wage war. And knowing that they would all die if they didn't take action. Um, Basically, an all out assault was taking place to allow the women, the older men who could not fight, the young boys who were not of fighting age, and the sick to basically leave the village and go deeper into the jungle. And after being evacuated, Ponca would basically lead the Spaniards to a now empty village where they would fight with all their might, each one dying down to the last man. But it was said that the jungle actually took Ponca's body and turned him into a jaguar. Now, this is where you get into the mythology of the jaguar protector, as it is said that the chief transformed into one and to this day still protect the jungle from greedy people. Now, in 1508, disagreements of the jurisdiction of Santa Maria la Antigua del Darien, which was between Cabo de la Vela, modern day Colombia, and Cabo Gracias a Dios, modern day Nicaragua, or what is now that area, along with Costa Rica and Panama. Now, the disagreements would begin due to the crown capitulations, giving Alonso de Ojeda the recently obtained area from Cacique Semaco by way of defeat by Enciso and Balboa himself. Now, Semaco was actually the first in the region in Panama to actually clash with the Spanish. When the Spaniards demanded food and gold, he refused and actually sent his messenger with the message saying, "We are not your servants." Excuse me. But he said, "We are not your servants. The river feeds us, not your king." Now, that's pretty bold. And actually, that was pretty smooth, if I might add. Now, Samaco and his men would also lead an all out assault against the Spanish. However, they would do it using the rainforest as a shield of protection. They, however, would all be defeated due to the superior weapons of the Spanish and their armor um, that defended well against any indigenous weapons. Now, after defeat, all of the gold and food would be taken and the village would be burned. And that site actually would become the first settlement of the Spanish, being named Santa Maria la Antigua del Darien. Ojeda would actually um, have the claim to fame because he would also claim Venezuela during this era and would be given the title of the first European to travel to Curacao, Guyana, and even Colombia. By 1511, going towards Santo Domingo, which of course we have already discussed is the Dominican Republic, and Cisco and Valdivia. Now remember, Valdivia was also one of the ones from the region where Cortés is from, Extremadura. Now, they would be on a boat carrying others while it crashed it actually crashed near modern Jamaica today. Now, the place that it crashed is actually called Las Viboros, which is off of the coast of Jamaica. The survivors drifted. They drifted towards the Yucatan coast, where they were captured and divided among chiefs. Now, these chiefs would have more than likely been Maya, as again they were on the Yucatan coast, and we know that the Yucatan was Maya territory, or people that we call Maya today. Which, fun fact that we will get into later, there's deep connections between the Southeast and the Mayas, but more on that later. Now, like I said, the survivors, they drifted to the Yucatan coast and they were captured. Now, this was where Valdivia's story would end, as he and several others were actually sacrificed to the ancestral gods of the Maya. Now, of the survivors, however, would be two of greater importance. Now, those being Geronimo de Aguilar and Gonzalo Guerrero. Although Spain had a lot of wealth coming from their new colonies, around 1509, the empire began to experience what we would call financial hardships, right? Or poor money management. Charles V of Spain actually would drain the empire due to several costly wars against the French, the Ottoman Empire, the Papal States, the Republic of Venice, Republic of Genoa, Austria, Bohemia, which is modern Czech Republic, and many other places. This would in turn cause them to borrow money, which in return would raise the amount of taxes that citizens would have to pay. Now, not wanting to bear the heavy cost of taxes, a lot of families actually took their chances and immigrated to new established regions of the Americas, continuing what would have been happening for the next 3 centuries: mass European migrations to the new colonies. Now, the taxes that were imposed actually helped spark the Dutch Revolt, which was the cause of major shifts not only in Europe but North America as well. The Protestant Reformation would soon kick off as well, causing its own mass migration to what is now the United States. It wasn't until Spain conquered Mexico and Peru that it hit a new level of wealth that made them not only the world's richest but most powerful empire. Legend has it that Aguilar, who was a Franciscan friar, and Guerrero, who was a sailor from Palos, they escaped captivity, avoiding being sacrificed, and actually ended up being enslaved by Chief Aquincus of Shamanzana. Now, both captives would eventually learn the language, more than likely Yucatec. Guerrero became a war chief for Nacha Khan, Lord of Chektumal. Now, of course, this would be after proving to have great military might. And by being war chief, he was given a native to marry. And of course, with doing this, he would actually father children, becoming who some would say were the first mestizos in Mexico. Now, of course, this is subjective because, you know, you can only go off of what history says as far as like context like that, like what's been written. But we weren't there. We don't know who was there prior to Guerrero, and there could have been several mestizo children by the time he got there. Who knows? Anyway, the native that he married was Zazilha, and she just so happened to be the daughter of Nacha Khan, which would make her a Mayan noble or a princess. This will be one of many unions between the Spanish and indigenous royal bloodlines. Now, this would actually be something that the Spanish crown forced to stop, as they realized how dangerous it could be with these Spanish marrying into the indigenous royal bloodline, because now they would have not only power and might through the Spanish, but also that power through the Indigenous, which of course conflict of interest. These conquistadors could kind of take over and have whole villages for themselves and practically do what they want to do outside of the king's wishes, if you kind of get where I'm going with that. Anyway, but over time, everyone, like I said, will claim that their kids with natives were the first. Now, with Guerrero, it was believed that he actually fought with the Maya against the invasion of Hernandez de Cordoba and the 1518 invasion of Juan de Grijalva. He fully assimilated into Mayan culture and is actually said to have declined Hernán Cortés' invitation to join the conquest of Tenochtitlan. It's actually said that when he was asked, he respectfully declined, but then also made it clear that he was now basically Mayan. His family was Mayan, his kids were Mayan, and basically what the Spanish were doing was now something that he couldn't agree with, and that he would allow him to leave in peace now, but if he was to see him again, that things would be different. Now, continuing to live and serve the Maya, he would eventually be killed by the Spanish during battle. There is actually a statue of Guerrero and his Mayan family in Acumel, Quintana Roo today. Aguilar, receiving the same invitation as Guerrero, actually joined Cortés and acted as a translator for him along with Malintzin, better known as La Malinche. So now we're going to get into who she is and why she played a major role in the conquest of the Aztecs. And actually, there's a mixed, reviews, or I guess mixed feelings from different people, right? Some look at her as, a sellout or a traitor to her people, but then others kind of look at her as a victim of not only slavery and abuse, but also just someone who was trying to survive the best way that she could. Now, you're entitled to your own opinions and to form them, and I'm just here trying to give you the raw, uncut stories. So Cortés, he would speak Spanish to Aguilar, who would in return translate the message into Yucatec, which would then be translated into Tecpelajotoli by Malinche. Now, being a fast learner and being able to learn Spanish with ease, she actually replaced Aguilar in the regards of importance to Cortés. Not only did she become his chief interpreter, she actually also became his mistress. Historians believe that she was born near Olutla into a noble family, which would explain how she spoke Tecpelajotoli, as this is a dialect that only the nobles speak. And I guess this was their language of royal business, if that makes sense. Now, after the death of Malinche's father, she was sold away by her mother and stepfather to ensure that her half-brother inherited the rights of an heir. After making her way to a group of Mayans, and by making her way, after being sold into slavery and reached the Yucatec region, as a call for peace, after battling the Spanish was defeated, the group that she went with, the Mayas, would basically give Cortés food and gold and women. And the latter would be how Malintzin ended up with Cortés. Or I should say Cortés ended up with Malintzin. Now, being such a great asset to Cortés, he used her to help locate Moctezuma, as she would be his way of communicating with the emperor. And, as I said, she became a concubine, producing children for him as well. Now, she was said to also convince different indigenous tribes to stand down and ally with the Spanish by instilling fear of their weapons and horses. A running trend that would be exposed is basically how some 500 men, some stragglers, some tired men with equipment that probably hasn't been serviced and who knows how long, could defeat great empires with over 150,000 skilled warriors, skilled in warfare either to an equal or greater level than they were. Even with the advantage of having horses and firepower, diseases, or even faith, doing such a feat would require much more. Before getting into a more in depth view of the conquest, though, of Meso and South America, let's take a moment to discuss the arsenal of the Spanish during that time. Now, first on the list, steel swords. The different indigenous groups were said to not have technology of steel making, so they would not have had any good defenses for it. The conquistador's sword could easily puncture and slice any shield or protective wear that was designed to protect you from weapons made of obsidian, stone, wood, or bones. Now, the next weapon to discuss would be firepower, such as cannons or the arquebus. Now, when people talk about firepower of the conquistadors, some of you may think that those guns back then had the same accuracy and power as modern guns. Well, I'm here to tell you it did not. The arquebus used was actually a primitive. It used a primitive version of a bipod, which I guess would help with recoil and maybe accuracy. Although accuracy wouldn't really be an issue, as a lot of European militaries would fire in volleys. The issue with this, though, would be reload time. Now, it would take about a minute to reload, which an indigenous archer could use his bow and arrows, to shoot several times. And by several, I'm talking about realistically between 8 to 15. And those 8 to 15 would be very accurate and very deadly. Now, cannons would, of course, take out several enemies at once while also producing a foreign sound along with a cloud of smoke, which had its own shock factor. But you also had lances, pikes, and daggers, all made from steel, which would have done vast damage to an indigenous warrior, whether he had protective gear or not. Horses, one of the most effective things that the Spanish used during battle, were no doubt a game changer, from providing a height advantage to carrying things or even providing speed and power. The horse rightfully struck fear in the natives. However, the amount of Spanish soldiers at hand, let's just say there were roughly 100 or less for cavalry, a few hundred infantry, and only a few guns. Even with their weapons advantage, they were still outmanned severely and in a foreign hostile environment unknown to them. So, sure, we give credit to the horses and the dogs, but their most effective weapon was actually the hundreds of thousands of indigenous allies, from providing intel, spies, food, manpower, porter services, medical treatment, loyalty, their lives, and even more, although I don't know what more you can give than your life. But nothing the Spanish possessed was a greater asset to them than their indigenous allies. Now, many times, the indigenous people of the Americas were portrayed as heathens, pagans, cannibals, you name it, bloodthirsty murderers, right? Just makers of war. We have to keep in mind that the people that washed up on their shores, they benefited for giving those type of descriptions. There were papal bulls created which gave the green light on conquest, murder, enslavement, genocide, and anything else to the people that fit those descriptions. In reality, most of Europe was filled with pagan practices since antiquity, even before. Even when Rome left their ancient practice of worshiping the Sol Invictus and adopted their newly formed religion known as Catholicism, many elements of the former would be carried over. Now, in fact, communion, the significance of the winter solstice, aka Christmas, or the vernal equinox, or known as Easter, right? Even the veneration of Mary, just to name a few, those are remnants of paganism that made its way into Christianity. So, to believe that the justification of what happened in the Americas was for the purpose of cleansing it with, cleansing it of the pagans, or to bring Christ to savages, or even to bring civilization to the primitive inhabitants of those areas would be naive, because those areas, as they would all quote, would be better than anything that they ever saw in Europe. So it's only accurate um, to say that they only came for one reason and one reason only. Well, a few reasons, but the main was to claim land for their crown and to become wealthy while doing it. Now, prior to the Aztecs or the Mexica, right? Because Aztecs, again, there were no one called the Aztecs in central Mexico in the 1400s or even the 1300s or 1500s. No such thing. They were known as the Mexica. Now, prior to their domination of the region of Tenochtitlan, they were hired mercenaries for the Tepanecs. Now, for over a century, they gained land, wealth, and connections during their tenure with them. It wasn't until the Mexica worn out their welcome with the Tepanecs and founded a new home among the Kalhua people that the perception of them changed, and they were then viewed as barbarians. Now, based off the story, look, I'm not going to disagree with that. So, essentially, the leader of the Mexica was given the daughter of a powerful chief to wed, and it was basically said to that chief, like, hey, we would love to marry your daughter, like basically take her and give her to, I get, let's just say, like one of our gods, somebody great, right? And the leader agreed. And so when they would come to basically celebrate the union, what happened next was a tad bit crazy, I must admit. So essentially, the Aztec leader sacrificed the princess and had his priests wear her filleted skin. Now, I don't have to tell you what a powerful chief who gave his daughter to someone to wed would have done when he arrived and saw like someone wearing her filleted skin. So, for obvious reasons, the Mexicas were once again on the move, this time with an army pursuing them. Now, it was then that the leader of the Mexicas had their vision of their new homeland, the area where they saw an eagle with a serpent in his mouth while perched on a cactus. And if that sounds vaguely familiar, just take a look at Mexico's flag and then it'll click. Now, it was here where the three city state alliance was formed, which comprised of Texcoco, Tacloban, and Tenochtitlan. At their height, they expanded in much of the region, stretching towards Guatemala. However, they were not able to expand westward due to the powerful Purepecha Empire stopping them. Now you see the connection? The reason why, we brought up Michoacan earlier. Now, around the year 1446, it was said that there was a natural disaster. which brought hardship to the empire. And by empire, speaking in regards to the Aztecs. Now, granted, others could have been affected as well, but we're just focusing on them for this moment. Now, in order to appease the gods and find favor, Tlacaelel increased the amount of human sacrifices. Now, a lot of history of the past order would be destroyed as the Aztecs were entering a new stage of their empire. Everyone was said to be educated. However, defeated foes were now forced to become tributary states and pay large tributes. This made the Aztecs very rich and hated at the same time, also planting the seed for their neighbors to try and find a way from under their rule. Now, with their new system in place, the Mexica no longer killed their enemies, but they practiced something called flowery wars, which were basically ritual wars in which their enemies were subdued and had sanctions and embargoes placed against them, which would weaken them. Now, the sacrificial victims needed for the increased sacrifices would actually come from these victims as well. With that being said, the way that the indigenous tribes in the Americas conducted warfare was extremely different than how the Europeans fought. The Aztecs and many other tribes would capture a lot of their enemies, while the conquistadors, or should I say the Europeans, their goal was to kill as many as quickly and brutally as possible, especially when dealing with those of the Americas. Also, wars was where a lot of the indigenous warriors earned their status, aka their nicknames. Now, only elite warriors could join certain orders, such as the Order of the Jaguar or the Order of the Eagle, which were warrior societies. Now, these could only be earned by military feats. So, to stand out during battle so that their feats could be recognized, commanders would wear elaborate suits of feathers, headdresses, right? Which unfortunately would make them easy targets for the conquistadors and their men during battle. Another difference in warfare was that the conquistadors preferred to take out as many enemies at a time. No distinction. However, the indigenous would practice this thing where they would have individual battles where opposing warriors of equal rank would fight hand-to-hand combat, with the loser being taken for sacrifice or to be a prisoner or to be adopted. Southeastern tribes who were a part of the Mississippian culture also practiced human sacrifice of this nature. Um, in fact, a lot of it would be in honor of their sun and moon deities, mainly of their enemies, of course. Now, one such tribe would be the Quapaw, whose chief warned the chief of his enemies, the Kaski, to pray to their gods of the sun and the moon for good seasons, hinting that once the Soto's expedition left their region, all peace between them would end and their warriors would be used for sacrifice. And of course, if I'm bringing this up, it's because I want you to remember it for a future reference. Now, one cannot rule out the possibility of the victims to the sacrifice were not just similar, like I said, to death row inmates of modern times, unlucky people whose transgressions could only be made right through death in the eyes of those who were conducting it, I should say. Now, once the Spanish made their way to the region, it's easy to see how they were able to recruit hundreds of thousands of native allies to bring down the mighty Aztecs. In 1519, Cortés was actually sent on a trade mission in present-day Cozumel. It was there where he allegedly heard about Moctezuma and his fortune. However, in reality, the Spaniards already knew about the Aztecs, the Mayas, the Incas, and other groups way before sailing to their lands. Most of their information would be gathered by the indigenous people of the Caribbean, who would have already had trade networks going with these people, or would have visited them from for other reasons, right? Again, large trade network, a lot of these societies actually came from regions from mainland Americas. And the Spanish were good at using their resources to find information. Also, in 1518, Grijalva would actually be sent on a reconnaissance mission by Cuba's governor Velasquez to make contact with the indigenous groups, such as the Chotalas of Tabasco and the Maya of the Yucatan, where many things were confirmed about the Aztecs, which would be crucial for their plan to conquer. The Chotales would also fight alongside the Spaniards against the Aztecs. Now, after leaving Cozumel, Cortés made it to Tabasco, where he found the Pontonchan people and started on what would be a warpath until he faced Moctezuma, his intended opponent. After defeating the Pontonchan people, he took several slaves and prisoners before making their way to what is now Veracruz. Now, by this time, Moctezuma was well aware of the foreigners on his soil. It would be hard not to, as you have to think, these massive empires had spies all over the place. So he basically received intel, and of course he would prepare his forces to find and defeat them. Now, it was Veracruz where Cortés decided to claim as his own colony, known as Villa de la Veracruz, and it was actually the first Spanish town in Mexico. This would actually be his base camp for further exploration. Now, several of his men would actually marry the daughters of nobles in that village. And that area would also be home to one of the older civilizations of the Americas known as the Olmecs. Now, it would actually soon become a tributary state of the Aztecs. And the Xicotlan tribe, which was another tribe that met the Spaniards, they would also shelter and feed Cortés and his men. They would also confirm things that, would help him out as far as, for example, that the Aztecs did not just rule over them, but 30 other territories as well. And that how none of them really cared for them because it was demanded of them to give tribute in the form of food, gold, slaves, and sacrificial victims. Now, so again, it's not hard to see how the Mexica had several hundreds of thousands who were more than happy to help aid Cortés in his pursuit of defeating Moctezuma. Now, you have to keep in mind that even though the Aztecs are painted as, and I'm not victim blaming, but they're painted as these people. Oh, and I'm sure you guys can hear my dogs, Oatly and Zeus, so say hello. Anyway, the Aztecs, I don't want to paint them as the woe is me. We are just these, indigenous people to the area who's always been here, and we now are being attacked by these outsiders unprovoked, and why we did nothing wrong. Now, that is correct. They did nothing wrong to the Spanish. However, the Aztecs were invaders themselves. So to the tribes or groups of people who were already in the region they occupied, they were essentially the Spanish to them, right? So now the Aztecs, they invaded, meaning that they came from somewhere else. Now, that place would be Aztlan, an area from the north, which, like I said, is now being thought to be the southwestern region of the United States. Now, like I said, coming from Aztlan, they basically defeated everyone in their path and started demanding tribute from a host of local tribes while, of course, enslaving them. Cortés and his men, along with his new allies, would make their way to Tlaxcala, where they faced hostility, of course. Why wouldn't they? Now, even though Tlaxcala was not particularly allied with the Aztecs, they heard of the destruction and violence that Cortés and his men brought to the region, along with the disrespect in their temples and way of life. So they understood clearly that if they did not fight the Spanish now, they would face the same fate later. So after being outpowered militarily, they did the next best thing. The Tlaxcala aided the Spanish and allied with them, resulting in them receiving many perks. The Spanish was known for rewarding their allies in hopes to bind their loyalty, warriors, and other things to use at their disposal. The gifts were, or should I say, the gifts that the Spanish would give would normally be weapons, horses, and high positions within their new world order, and the right to live with some type of autonomy without much interference by the Spanish. So you would have to imagine that these gifts did not come cheap, and information provided would need to be extremely helpful, such as the inner working of the Aztec's kingdom, knowledge of the infrastructure and how to bring it down, spies to get close to Moctezuma and his empire, and to report things, even to plant seeds of misinformation and confusion. So many of the turncoats that the Spanish used, you have to remember, they had no loyalty to Moctezuma as they were mostly people who were conquered by him. Now, the next group that Cortez and his men ran into were the Cholulas. They were actually a sister tribe of the Mexica and actually migrated down with them from Aztlan. They would offer the Spanish to provide them with much needed food and rest. However, what happened next is up for debate, as each side would have their own version of events. The Spanish tells of a tale that the Cholulas were secretly sent by Moctezuma to destroy the Spanish, only to be discovered by Malinche after she was approached by some of the native women to join them and help destroy the Spanish. Cortez then gathered all of the indigenous nobles and priests and commanders, now acting as judge, jury, and executioner. He accused them all of ill intent and murdered them all. So, to bring things into perspective, this was actually a holy city, and there were not even many warriors present due to that nature. So, what the Spanish claimed that they were going to do, it's kind of hard to say, like, because that was, like I said, a holy place. And you have to remember the indigenous people were very, very, very particular about their religion and their customs, and they wouldn't do that just based off of the historical context of like a lot of things that you will see and hear about in later videos. Now, the killing didn't just stop with them. It also spread to the unarmed crowds. They were all massacred, women, men, children alike, murdered while their village was ransacked. Now, being traditional enemies of the Tlaxcalas, they did not have to be axed twice. And by them being enemies, I mean the Aztecs, being traditional enemies. You didn't have to axe the Tlaxcalas twice to help destroy them. Now, being such an important city of the Aztec Empire, I'm pretty sure the destruction of Cholula sent waves of anger and even fear to the capital of the Aztecs, which was in Tenochtitlan. So while the Spanish pressed forward their settlement, Veracruz, that was left with a few men for protection, was attacked. Some believe that Chimalpopoca, which was the son of the first Tlatoni, Acampitzli, and a former Tlatoni himself, serving before Moctezuma I, was behind the attack, while others believe that it was a group of Spaniards actually who were sent to find and arrest Cortez for going rogue. Now, the term Tlatoni would be no different than chief or cacique, right? It's just basically the name of their leader. Now, once Cortez made it to the Aztec capital, he wasted no time acting on his plan to take over. As it would be read many times in the near future, the requiremento, or the requirement, was soon read to the natives, informing those who were able to hear that on behalf of the monarchs, that all men are inferior to their God, and every man in the world falls under his reign, and must obey him, and must accept their faith, by their own free will, of course, in order to be given favor. Now, those that did not were promised that, with the help of God, their kingdoms will be entered forcefully. War shall be made against them in all ways possible, while turning their children and wives into slaves, and to justly murder the men at will, while taking all possessions of the heathens, and inflicting as much damage as humanly possible, without any guilt, as it would be the doing of those who refused to accept the requirements, in which they had no understanding, of course, of what was being read at all, as the indigenous did not speak the language of the Spaniards, at least not prior to conquest. Now, after a daring attempt that paid off greatly for the Spanish, Moctezuma was made a prisoner in his own kingdom and forced to do whatever Cortés ordered, at the expense of making the once mighty emperor lose face in the eyes of his subjects and humiliate him beyond repair. The emperor eventually forced to renounce his status as emperor and was forced to recognize King Charles V as the true emperor. Now, while these things were going on and was working out in Cortés' favor, he actually got word that the Cuban governor sent Spanish forces to arrest him for his insubordination and his hijacking of Veracruz as his own personal colony. So while dealing with that, his men quickly started to abuse the Aztecs, in which they were left to basically work on the relations. And of course, when the boss is gone, the job doesn't get done, right? So essentially, instead of easing the tensions, all hell broke loose. And there was a battle. So the Spanish, having conquest on their mind from the beginning, of course they would do their due diligence with their reconnaissance. Now, my thoughts, after studying several accounts of the Spanish interactions with several groups of the Indigenous Americans, it's that incidents like Aguilar was not by chance. By sending a religious figure to go in peace and to build a connection to the people and to act as ambassador, it was actually easy to learn the ways of the people. Now, this occurrence would happen over and over again with different colonization efforts. Another example would be how the Spanish would use inside information about the indigenous to manipulate and play off of their superstition. And this is documented with the meeting of Luis Geronimo de Ore and an Inca nobleman, Garcilaso de la Vega, the great-great-grandson of Pachacuti. Now, they would meet in Spain, as this is where the Inca reside. So the friar would ask the Inca about any information he had about Florida, as he was about to send over 20 friars to that region of Florida to evangelize the Indians, and wanted them acquainted with the ways and customs of the natives, in which he was provided with written works from another nobleman from Peru, Guaman Poma, who was a direct descendant of a noble family from the Yarawilka dynasty, an empire that predates the Inca. Now, think about this for a minute. Why would he be asking the Inca about information about the indigenous people of Florida? I'm just going to let you ponder on that until we get to that section of, or that video in the series. Now, in the 8 years that Aguilar was with the Mayans, he learned their customs, their language, their ways of war, and their omens. With that being said, it is a known thing that many of the indigenous did not believe in making war during their religious festivals or other important holidays or holy days. So this information would have been given to Cortés, and as you see, with those several inside tips on when to make his move, the best chance would have been the festival of Tenochtitlan, which was dedicated to the Aztec god Tezcatlipoca. Now, this would be the perfect opportunity to strike. So, while the Aztecs, along with all of their war captains and warriors, they celebrated, the conquistadors readied themselves for war. The exits to the plaza where the Aztecs danced and sang all night long were closed off to where no one could enter or escape. And in a moment's notice, all of the unarmed natives, as this was a religious festival, so there would be no need to have weapons. All of them were slaughtered, with no escape route. Now, as the screams were heard from the plaza, the remaining warriors would come with any weapon that they could find, seeking revenge against the Spanish for that barbaric, that inhumane act which was just committed. So, to regain control of the city, and when I say he, the Spanish, so Cortez, they would force Moctezuma to address his subjects, but not realizing that the Aztecs already chosen a new Tlatoni, which was the brother of Moctezuma. Now, the puppet king was slain either by the Spanish who no longer had any use for him, or by his own people who realized that he was no longer in control, but just a puppet. So, under the attack of hundreds of thousands of native warriors, Cortez was fearing for survival, asked for a ceasefire. He sent word to the Aztecs that he would return all of their stolen treasure and would leave the city if granted a safe exit. Now, by this point, they knew that the Spanish had no honor, and their, wishes fell upon deaf ears. So, while trying to escape with as much treasure as possible, many Spanish died trying to flee the city, as well as losing most of their horses and artillery and even their treasure. Known now as La Noche Triste, the Spanish were kicked out of the Aztec capital, which now laid in ruins. Now, when I say kicked out of their capital, they were actually defeated. So after making their escape, which included bloody battles for their life, Cortez and his men made it back to Tlaxcala, where they would regroup, re-strategize, and then come back eventually to destroy the Aztec Empire, this time taking full control of the people once and for all. So, although Moctezuma was murdered, his bloodline would continue to survive, and actually marry into Spanish nobility, becoming excuse me, but becoming prominent families. So one such descendant would be his great granddaughter, Ana Mendoza de la Cerda, and her marriage to the second viceroy of New Spain, who was Luis de Velasco, which produced the future Marquis of Vallehermosa. Now, also, there's actually a royal title that is given to the bloodline of Moctezuma, which still exists today in Spain, and it's actually the highest title that you could have in Spain, and it's a duke title, the Duke of Teletongo de Moctezuma, something like that. Can't remember off the tip of my tongue, but actually I'll have it up on the screen where you can actually take a look at that. Now, understanding the full scale of events that took place, the Aztecs realized that many of their former enemies and even their allies would have joined the ranks of the Spanish. This prompted them to send emissaries to other regions for aid and assistance. One of the regions that we would focus on would be the western region of Mexico, in which the Aztecs sent word out requesting help for one last united stand against the invaders. Now, we will focus on the call of help to their well-respected enemies from the kingdom of Purepecha. Now, this kingdom consisted of the modern-day Mexican states of Michoacan, there goes Michoacan again, Jalisco, Guerrero, and Guanajuato. Now, the Purepecha, also referred to as Tarascans, although that is a derogatory term, they were said to be different from the rest of the people from Mexico in many ways, not only including their language, but also their customs and their use of metal tools for weapons. Now, it was actually believed at one point that the Andean region, like their civilizations such as the Incas, the Huayhuaca, and the Chaban, possessed metallurgy. But actually, I'm starting to see that that's not really the case. And the Purepecha is proof that there were others that actually possessed metallurgy. But I will also say that there's a connection to the older civilizations of Peru and the Purepecha. And I personally believe that they could have been, and by they, I mean the Purepecha, they were basically an offshoot or a distant outpost of a past Andean civilization which stretched into that region. Now, the Purepecha successfully prohibited the Aztecs from further western expansion and successfully repelled their attacks on multiple occasions, proving to be a formidable force to be respected. And eventually, they would live in peace as the Aztecs realized that waging war against them would not work in their favor. So, whenever the emissaries reached the kingdom of Purepecha and requested aid against the Spanish, they were actually killed, sending a clear message to the Aztecs that they will not aid them in their time of need. Now, going through their own issues at the time of the Aztecs' downfall, the Purepecha chose not to fight, but instead struck a deal with the Spaniards, which would soon prove to be one sided. The decision actually sealed not only the fate of the Aztecs, but those of the Purepecha and smaller groups as well. For if they actually joined forces, they actually stood a great chance at defeating Cortez and his men. The mass manipulation of tribes who were in the middle of civil conflicts would result in the fall and enslavement of many great Mesoamerican and North and South American empires. So, once the Aztecs were subdued, Tanguishan II pledged his allegiance as a vassal to the King of Spain. Now, as usual, the conquistadors plundered the region, and once they had no need for the ruler, they disposed of him the only way that the conquistadors know how: execution. Now, according to folklore, his daughter, Princess Irendita, who despised the Spaniards, promised one of the warriors her hand in marriage if he was successful in repelling the Spanish forces. Cristobal de Olid approached the capital of Tenzin, which was the name that the Purepecha actually had for what is now known as Michoacan, or that empire of, the Purepecha. So he approached the capital with just 500 Spanish soldiers and about 10,000 plus allies, indigenous allies, and quickly neutralized the Purepecha forces by capturing their war general and even enlisting some of the Purepecha warriors to capture their own king. The princess then took matters into her own hand to defend her people and gathered men to meet the resistance. During one of the battles, where they were able to fight off the Spanish forces, it said that Herediter captured a Spanish horse and took refuge. You can actually see an image of this in a mural that's painted in Michoacan. Um, Now, with his daughter gone, the Kazonsky, which was the title for the Purepecha chief, he actually converted to Catholicism and allowed the destruction of their temples and deities and allowed his subjects to be baptized. Unfortunately, he was still accused of being pagan and was burned at the stakes. Learning about the fate of her father, however, the princess then led a huge revolt against the Spanish. And as for her fate, there are several theories, but no one knows for certain. However, after these events, it is certain that Spain soon consolidated their conquered territories and brought them all together under New Spain. To see the depiction of the history of the Purepechas, you can see the mural of La Historia de Michoacán, which is located in present-day Pátzcuaro in Michoacán, in a former temple turned library. And it was actually painted by Juan O'Gorman, grandson of Charles O'Gorman, the first British consul to Mexico. The princess had a younger brother, Antonio Huitzzimingari, who was what people would consider the last pure-blood Purepecha governor of the province of Michoacan. Now, after his death in 1562, some of his children actually inherited chiefdoms in the region. After those major feats, however, the next major target would be the Maya territories. Now, the Maya were comprised of several Maya city states, each one being controlled by its own ruler, having their own regions where each royal family would rule. The Spaniard Montejo, who was the leader of the Maya conquest, would actually instruct his men to only attack the indigenous who were not in support of their colonization efforts. Now, as ironic as this may sound, the Maya too, I know you're not going to believe this, but they were going through civil conflicts as well, which made it easy for the Spanish to eventually capitalize off and conquer them. Now, during this era of Spanish conquest, more attention has normally been given to Hispaniola and Mesoamerica, mainly the Aztec Empire. Now, you had other explorations and conquest attempts which was happening elsewhere by the Spanish, so I'm going to briefly discuss some of the lesser known events. So let's go back to when Cortés declared himself second to only Charles V and claimed independence from the governor of Cuba, who was Diego Velázquez de Cuellar, who also sponsored his expedition. That act, it caused factions to grow and disagreements escalated to the point that the crown felt that Cortés and Velázquez would basically come to blows. Now, as a result, they sent down Lucas Vasquez de Leon to speak with both parties and to convince them to settle the dispute legally in court. This was the party that, along with Panfilo de Narvaez, arrived to take Cortés into custody. Now, sorry, but that's a little funny. Now, persuading them to take no action against him and to actually join him in the conquest, Leon was then sent back to Santo Domingo, his efforts in vain. But after being reinstated to the Audiencia, he hired Francisco Gordillo to go on a slaving raid on the island of Guanahani, renamed San Salvador by the Spanish. But this is basically one of the modern islands of the Bahamas today. Now, by the time they arrived to San Salvador, it was already depopulated of the Lucayans, as they were dispersed to several other regions within the Spanish Empire or to Europe, or unfortunately murdered. Some actually did escape though, and would actually go to certain places like such as Florida for an example. But anyway, in June of 1521, Leon and his crew actually arrived near Winyah Bay, near present-day Georgetown, South Carolina, my city of birth and where my family's from. Now, he would make contact with the local indigenous people of the area, who were the Winyahs, or the Weenie, named after the Weenie River, now known as the Black River, which I grew up off of. Also, the Iswa, or the Catawba, the Siwi, the Pidi, and the Chicora, just to name a few of the different tribes that inhabited that area. After getting reports of the legendary land of Chicora, and if you're from the Grand Strand or even Georgetown, even the Low Country, honestly, you've seen or heard Chicora before. Now, of course, after all of the reports on that land, things of interest, around 140 indigenous was actually said to be kidnapped by the Spanish by way of trickery, and they were taken back to Hispaniola to be sold as slaves. A native who actually learned Spanish and was baptized was given the name Francisco de Chicora. He accompanied Leon the following year to go to Spain to request permission to colonize Winyah Bay. Now, it was there that the court chronicler Peter Martyr met with the Indian known as Chicora. And they basically had great talks about Winyard Bay, speaking at great lengths about his homeland and the neighboring tribes. Allian would actually use this information to present to the king as a reason why they should be allowed to put a colony there. So afterwards, the permission was granted to colonize the area. He would then bring with him Francisco de Chicora and other slaves from Hispaniola. Now, a lot of scholars would say that those slaves were African. However, you got to keep in mind that during this era, any slaves that was being taken throughout the Americas was 10 times out of 10 indigenous, either to the Caribbean or to other regions from the Americas that the Spanish already took over. Because during this region, slaves were literally the indigenous people, and for a long time in the Americas. And actually, when you get to, let's say, in North America, for example, up until 1865, you still had a large portion of those slaves being indigenous. Although some Africans did come through, the majority, as you will see throughout the series, were not of African origin. Now, they returned to Winyard Bay, and there was a short-lived colony called San Miguel de Guadalupe. So once back home, it was documented that Francisco, along with the slaves on board, revolted and escaped the ship, joining the local population, never to be seen again. But what isn't mentioned often was that when, and now this is documented by the friar Luis Geronimo de Or, that the Indians would welcome the Spanish as they returned and had festivals which lasted about 3 days. Then one night, all of a sudden, the Indians attacked, getting revenge for the enslaving of their people on Allian's first voyage, and slaughtered many. Allian would meet his end shortly after escaping their failed attempt to secure the colony, never to return to Hispaniola. The Spanish would be unsuccessful at setting up a lasting colony until 1565, when they founded St. Augustine, Florida. Between the times of Spain's first attempt to colonize somewhere in the modern-day United States, up until their success in 1565, several Spaniards actually tried their hand at exploring the southern, or the southeastern region, I should say, of the United States. And of course, facing waves of hostile tribes every turn they made. Hernando de Soto traveled through present-day Florida, Georgia, the Carolinas, north and south to be exact, Alabama, Tennessee, Mississippi, and Arkansas, where he ended up dying after being wounded, weak, low on men and supplies. And he actually was said to be buried in the Mississippi River. Now, given that during this campaign in the Southeast consisted of many American Indian slaves, as well as Taino and Carib slaves, along with mestizo children from the Caribs and the Spanish, brought with them from the Caribbean, one can safely assume that the recently defeated Aztecs who were shipped to Cuba as slaves, along with the Incas, also assisted De Soto on his mission, by force, of course. And I don't even want to say safely assume, because it's a fact that they did. Now, although St. Augustine was dubbed the oldest continuously occupied European settlement in the contiguous United States, it was not the first Spanish colony. On the Gulf region of the state was a colony called Santa Maria de Ochus in modern-day Pensacola, which is in Florida. Now, this was in the late 1550s. The colony was founded by none other than the noble-born cousin of the Viceroy of New Spain. Keep it in the family, right? Now, it was the cousin of the Viceroy, Antonio de Mendoza, and the wife of Hernán Cortés, Juana de Zuniga. His name was actually Tristan de Luna y Arellano. Now, before he was sent on an expedition with orders from the crown to colonize Florida, he was in Oaxaca, Mexico, assisting in ending a rebellion by the indigenous groups of the area. The same region that he assisted in putting down the rebellious indigenous was also the area that his relative was named Marquis over. Highly likely this is no coincidence, but he also would go on expeditions with Francisco Vasquez de Coronado to the 7 cities of Cibola, along with other feats, as he spent years in Mexico. His orders were clear: set up a colony on the Gulf Coast of Florida and clear a path to St. Helena, present day St. Helena, South Carolina, which was actually the capital of Spanish Florida for a time, while also setting up an additional colony. When he left Mexico to embark on his mission, he did what many conquistadors did. He ensued the guidance and the help of their conquered enemies. With his fleet, there were over 1,000 colonists who would help the new colonies grow. About 500 soldiers, hundreds of Aztec warriors, and their families. A major hurricane, however, that happened around September 19th of 1559 would wreck a majority of his ships while they were docked on the coast, causing a huge amount of supplies to be lost. Knowing that the southeastern Indian tribes were major agriculturists, remember, he already had people that kind of came through and scoped out and left writings about these different groups. Now, they were agriculturalists and hunters with large reserves of food. A group of Mesoamerican warriors of Aztec origin were actually sent inland to make contact with these tribes. Now, like I said, De Soto would have mapped out the area and gave important information on his expedition, like his findings within the southeast to aid future Spanish expeditions. He would even bring animals like pigs and cows and just let them go and become feral. So when future expeditions came, there would be meat for the soldiers to find and eat. Now, although many of the survivors from De Soto's expedition were captains, and a lot of those survivors were actually captains in Tristan's company. So a lot of these people already knew where they were going and who they were going to run into. The reconnaissance crew actually made contact with the Pacani Indians of the Indian town of Pacana or Nanipacana. Now, that could be spelled Ypacana. If I didn't know any better, I would say that is spelled like a lot of the names that you would see like in South America and Mesoamerica during, a lot of their indigenous history. Anyway, but people from there would actually have faced brutality at the hands of De Soto previous expedition. So as more men from his settlement joined them at that town of Nanipacana, relations began to sour as the Indians carried out several attacks, which was justified because, they were really decimated by De Soto. So as time went on and more issues appeared, the Spaniards and their men traveled to the chiefdom of Coosa, one of the four mother towns of the Muskogee Creek Confederacy, which was located in modern Gordon and Murray counties in Georgia, along the Coosawhattie River. By the time Tristan's men reached these villages in Florida and Alabama, their numbers were greatly reduced by earlier expeditions and wars waged on them by previous Spanish conquistadors. And you're going to see this throughout all kind of mainstream academics that, it was diseases that accounted for the population decline that wiped out like 80%, 70% of the indigenous. Well, to be honest, that's nowhere near accurate. That's a lie. These people weren't disappearing because of illnesses. They were either being shipped out of the Americas into other regions as slaves, being massacred, or just becoming exterminated on paper as their former entity and joining other groups of people and becoming known as another group. Now, in 1972, the important capital of the chiefdom, as of 1475, which had 3 platform mounds, were destroyed to construct the dam of Carter's Lake, destroying a lot of artifacts that could have been discovered, which could have provided a deeper insight to the people. Now, by 1560, a portion of the Aztecs would have returned home to their families, and a lot of the Spaniards either returned to Veracruz or Havana, leaving a few hundred to fulfill the mission of setting up a colony at Santa Helena, as Spain wanted an overland route from Mexico to the coast of the Low Country to where they could then take their gold, where which would eventually make it to Europe and escape like a lot of the pirates of the Caribbean, which is funny, but we're gonna get into that too. And when I tell you, this would make Jack Sparrow seem like child play. However, um, around um, so okay, there were basically those left to set up the colony of Santa Helena. Now there wouldn't be a successful Spanish colony, like I said, until 1560s. But many attacks from thousands of Indians from the low country of South Carolina, including the Casabo, the Guale, the Kiowa, and many others, um, as well as coastal Georgia tribes. Wars known as the Escamaco Wars would play a role in Spain abandoning the site at St. Helena, but also was a huge reason why it was easy for the British to come and take control of Charleston, the Beaufort area of South Carolina. Another Spanish explorer who would come to present day North Carolina, South Carolina, and Tennessee in the 1500s was Juan Pardo. And I'll give more details later regarding these expeditions. However, one thing that is very evident in the connection between tribes of the southeastern states of the U.S., tribes of the Caribbean, Mesoamerica, and South America. And we're going to go deeper into that like each segment of these videos. But thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed and learned something new. So have a great day and see you guys next time.